We have 3:30 on the dot. Welcome everyone to another installment of Fridays on the Ridge. My name is Codie Eash, Director of Education and Interpretation here at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center. Whether it's your first time or for many of you, many times that you've been here, welcome or welcome back. It's always a pleasure to see as we get further into the spring, especially here, more and more faces. We've had amazing turnouts to these so far this year, almost every single Friday. We can usually count just based on visitation patterns in January, February. We can usually count on anywhere from half a dozen to a dozen people and be satisfied with a Friday afternoon program. But as many of you can attest to have been here to several of these, the room has been nearly full for nearly all of them in January, February, and now as we've gotten into March. Now, this afternoon we're going to focus on a topic that in many ways we sort of touch on in multiple different capacities, both in the museum exhibits on the third floor, as well as a piece of a lot of our other interpretive programs. Everything from the museum exhibits themselves that focus on the story of the Seminary Hospital to our Run the Hospital and Mending the Wounded programs that we do for school groups. We're coming up on field trip season here in the next couple of weeks. We'll be talking a lot about surgeons, nurses, and patients with K-12 students, especially middle and high schoolers. We talk about these sort of topics in our Living Museum, which we do during the course of our 24 hours on the Ridge each fall, where we go through a candle-lit tour of the third floor, meeting up with one wounded patient, meeting up with one surgeon, and meeting up with a nurse, and sort of looking at that full story of the Seminary Hospital through those personal lens. And then also we do our popular series of walking tours, our sunset tours throughout the summer, and on Legacy Weekend, oftentimes focusing not as much on the personal aspect of the hospital, but rather the big picture logistical challenge that the Seminary Hospital poses to the people who live and work in and also around this building, because it wasn't just in this building that these nearly 700 estimated patients are being treated, but it's across the entirety of the seminary campus. And so there are many different ways we've looked at this hospital. The way we're going to do that this afternoon is through a really specific lens. We're going to look at the firsthand accounts of nurses, and in this case, particularly women nurses who are serving here at the Seminary Hospital. I thought this would be a great way for us to honor Women's History Month with several programs along these lines. And we're going to especially look at 4 accounts that we'll pull up on screen here in a moment. And I've chosen these 4 accounts, A, because they're the most plentiful, and B, because if you're interested in digging into this more, they're the easiest to access for free online. And I'll show you exactly where you can find these digitized accounts of the nurses we'll be largely focusing on here this afternoon. But overall, on our lists of patients, surgeons, and nurses, we have 493 patients we've been able to identify. I believe it's somewhere around 36 or so doctors and surgeons, and 144 attendants. And we use that term attendants to refer to everyone from civilian nurses to military nurses to cooks to those who are cleaning wounds to the civilians, the Zieglers who lived in this building. All of those folks combined add up to 144 people whose names we know were involved in some way here at the Seminary Hospital. The unfortunate reality with many of them, though, is that we have nothing that they've left behind, nothing that they've written about their time here. We know their name. Sometimes we only know their last name. In some instances, we know that there was a Mrs. Crawford here, for instance, but we don't have Mrs. Crawford's first name. We don't know her affiliation, but she pops up on someone else's account, and so we can add her to the list. And so when we really narrow in on the people whose names we know and whose words we have written, we're going to look at basically the entirety of those folks here throughout the course of the next 45 minutes or so. And that gives us some sense of when we pull source material from a Civil War hospital, even if there were a ton of people in that hospital, when you're looking at the actual people who were doing the nursing, cleaning wounds, dressing wounds, writing letters on soldiers' behalves, oftentimes we really have to mine for that source material to figure out exactly what is happening on any given day, in this case in the summer of 1863. So there will be some names that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, maybe some that you've heard the name, but not much else beyond that context. But these are the primary 4 on whom we're going to focus today. Sarah Broadhead, living in Gettysburg on Chambersburg Street in the summer of 1863. She's 30 years old. Her husband, Joseph Broadhead, is going to be involved in the days before the battle and going out to the South Mountain Range around Cashtown with a group of other Adams County men trying to block the gap as Confederate forces are beginning to make their way eastward, coming through Gettysburg eventually on June 26th. She's going to spend ample time here at the Seminary Hospital, and she writes extensively about the beginning stages of the post-battle Seminary Hospital. We'll read several accounts from her diary dated July 5th to July 10th especially. So we can get a great window sort of into the early operations of the Seminary Hospital right after the Confederate retreat. Her diary of a lady of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania encompasses a month overall, June 15th to July 15th, 1863. And it has been digitized by Cornell University. There we go. And so you can find this online. If you go to the Cornell University Library Digital Collections, here you can find Diary of a Lady of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania from June 15th to July 15th, 1863. And you can read the entirety of the pamphlet in this form. Her diary she kept on a daily basis. She chose to publish this one month section specifically so that she could sell copies of it to benefit the United States Sanitary Commission. And particularly, this is going to benefit the Sanitary Commission Fair that happens in Philadelphia in June 1864. An event that some of you have heard me talk about before. President Lincoln attends it and gives a rather remarkable speech in that fourth spring of the Civil War. Sarah Broadhead is selling copies of this diary, this 1 month span, right before, during, and right after the Battle of Gettysburg. She's selling it for that benefit. So we'll take a look momentarily at what she says about her time at this hospital here, but it's a remarkable resource. Our second person is Emily Souder. Oftentimes you'll see her referred to in 19th century terminology as Mrs. Edmund Souder, going solely by her husband's name. That's her byline on this pamphlet, Leaves from the Battlefield of Gettysburg. She comes over from Philadelphia, and she'll be at several hospitals, including this one relatively briefly. We'll take a look at what she says, but this one has been digitized at archive.org and archived by the Lincoln Financial Foundation collection. This one in book style, you can flip right through the entirety of her pamphlet. Likewise, just like Sarah Broadhead's, published in 1864 as well. Our third one is also 1864, so we have three accounts that are published right after the Battle of Gettysburg, the very next year, and they all three are of slightly different sorts. Sarah Broadhead's is a diary, a daily diary she's writing on the day these events occurred. Emily Souder's is by and large a series of letters that she's sending home, likewise on the day that she's here and in the months that follow. Martha Eller's account, Hospital Scenes from the Battle of Gettysburg, July 1863, is an organizational history of the Patriot Daughters of Lancaster, a ladies' aid association based in Lancaster County, 55 or so miles to the east of Gettysburg. She does not ever write her own name as the byline. She's writing anonymously on behalf of her entire organization, the Patriot Daughters, but likewise this one has been digitized by Internet Archive at archive.org by the Boston Public Library. So we'll take a look at what she says looking back the following year. She's writing this in 1864, thinking back to the summer prior in 1863. They are primarily, for a good chunk of this account, talking about making their way to Gettysburg, which has its own set of complications with the bridge from Wrightsville to Columbia having been burnt on June 28th. They have to basically canoe and paddle themselves across the Susquehanna River, a mile-wide stretch of the river, to get themselves from Lancaster County into York County before making the trek through the burned remnants of Wrightsville and ultimately making their way to Gettysburg, where they'll be initially stationed for the most part at Christ Lutheran Church, but then will eventually make their way here to the seminary. So we'll take a look at what Martha Eller says there. And then finally, Fanny Bueller, whose recollections of the rebel invasion and one woman's experience during the Battle of Gettysburg is written in 1896, is not published until 1900, and that has been digitized likewise, Internet Archive, a treasure trove for these digitized sources, by the Allen County Public Library Genealogy Center. So this is, unlike the other three accounts we're looking at, not written in the moment. She's writing this a few decades later. She is the wife of, what is Bueller's first name? David Bueller, who is the Gettysburg postmaster in 1863, heavily involved with Republican Party politics in Adams County, a well-regarded Gettysburg figure. And Fanny Bueller serves, for the most part, at the courthouse hospital in the summer of 1863. But she tells us as well, as we will see, a bit about her time here at the Seminary Hospital. So all four of these are readily available sources. We can come back to this a little later if anybody has any questions about the sources themselves at the end of our time. But the first place that I want to focus is the person who writes the most about her experience here as a nurse at the Seminary Hospital, and that's Sarah Brodhead. A famous name, a famous face, featured heavily throughout the exhibits here at the museum, featured extensively in famous Civil War media and books, including, probably most famously, Ken Burns' Civil War series on PBS more than 30 years ago. And she writes extensively, as I mentioned, about that period before the battle, her experience during the battle, and then when she leaves her Chambersburg Street home and makes her way to the west side of town on July 5th, this is the first place that she comes. Now, how I want to structure this afternoon is, by and large, letting these women speak for themselves. They've given us these ample first-hand accounts. They can tell me what they experienced far better than I can tell you what they experienced. So by and large, we're going to just take a look at chunks of these first-hand accounts and take a step back and see what we can learn from them. This is what she says July 5th. It's 2 days after the battle has effectively concluded. It's the day that Robert E. Lee's army is really starting to fully evacuate Seminary Ridge. It's 4 days removed from fighting that would have taken place right here on the ridge that produced most of the wounded Union soldiers who had been brought into this building. We're starting to see now this sort of reclamation of Seminary Ridge by federal troops who are returning here for the first time since July 1st, by and large. Dr. George New had established this hospital on the morning of July 1st. And by this point in time, by the aftermath of the battle, we're looking at least 200 wounded U.S. soldiers who are being treated mostly in this building. But in the days that follow, we're going to start to see that there are soldiers brought in from other hospitals. In the weeks that follow, more and more Confederate soldiers begin to arrive here as other hospitals across the battlefield are being consolidated, and this becomes a general hospital. This is what she says July 5th when she comes here for the first time. July 5th, what a beautiful morning. It seems as though nature was smiling on thousands suffering. One might think, if they saw only the sky and earth and trees, that everyone must be happy. But just look around and behold the misery made in so short a time by man. Early this morning I went out to the seminary, just outside of town, and which, until the retreat, was in the hands of the enemy. What horrible sights present themselves on every side, the roads being strewn with dead horses and the bodies of some men, though the dead have nearly all been buried, and every step of the way giving evidence of the dreadful contest. Shall we, for I was not alone, enter the building or return home? She's asking this rhetorical question that night as she's thinking back a few hours earlier. Could I face the decision to enter that building knowing what scenes might present themselves? Can we endure the spectacle of hundreds of men wounded in every conceivable manner? Some in the head and limbs, here an arm off and there a leg, and just inside a poor fellow with both legs shot away. It is dreadful to behold. And to add to the misery, no food has been served here for several days. A lot of soldiers especially, who were wounded here in this hospital, would reflect on that. George McFarland, commanding officer of the 151st Pennsylvania, eventually the last patient to leave this hospital, he would write about the fact that when he was wounded and carried into this building by one of his soldiers, Private Lyman Wilson, that pretty much immediately after this becomes Confederate-occupied July 1st, Confederate soldiers strip away food, water, medical instruments. We would presume to take them to primarily Confederate field hospitals at that point in time. And so Sarah Brodhead now 4 days later is seeing the effects of that. She's saying these men have not been fed for the most part since July 1st. She continued, "The little we have," meaning food, "will not go far with so many. What can we do is the only question. And the little we brought was distributed. It is heart-sickening to think of these noble fellows sacrificing everything for us and saving us, and it is out of our power to render any assistance of consequence. I turned away and cried. We returned to town to gather up more food if possible, and to get soft material to place under their wounded limbs to make them much more comfortable. And so that's her initial impression of this place. As she comes in and she sees it's an absolutely dire situation. Not only wounded men, but wounded men who have not received very much, if any, treatment since they sustained their wound 4 days ago. They don't even have something so simple as sustenance to eat. She goes home and she starts baking. And she writes later in her account from that evening, I was kept baking cakes until nearly noon and in consequence did not return to the seminary. So that's her first day at the seminary. She intends to come back. She has to bake so many cakes that she says that I do not have the opportunity to actually go back. She'll pick up her account 2 days later, on July 7th. We found on reaching the hospital, meaning this hospital, the Seminary Hospital, that a wagon load of bread and 50 pounds of butter had arrived, having been sent in from the country, and a supply of what the soldiers call hardtack, she puts it in quotes, she must not be very familiar with the notion of hardtack, had been distributed. All got some to eat, but not as much as they desired. Government meat is processed for tomorrow, and a full supply of provisions. I assisted in feeding some of the severely wounded, and when I perceived that they were suffering on account of not having their wounds dressed, I did not know whether I could render any assistance in that way, but I thought I would try. And this becomes a theme of a lot of these accounts, is that they are immediately going to have to come to terms they're doing something entirely outside of their comfort zones. And that's a theme especially for Sarah Broadhead. We'll come full circle at the very end of our time with a line that she will reflect on later this day. But she continued telling us exactly how she went about this process of moving beyond her comfort zone. I procured a basin and water and went to a room where there were 7 or 8 men, some shot in the arms, others in the legs, one in the back, another in the shoulder. I asked if anyone would like to have his wounds dressed. Someone replied, there is a man on the floor who cannot help himself. You would better see to him. Stooping over him, I asked for his wound, and he pointed to his leg. Such a horrible sight I had never seen, and hoped to never see again. His leg was covered with worms. I inquired, was there no doctor in the building? If there was, I must see him. One was brought, and I asked how the men ever came in such a condition. He said enough men had not been detailed to care for the wounded, and that man had been wounded in the first day's fight, and held by the rebels until the day previous, and that the surgeons had not yet had time to attend to them all. And at any rate, there were not enough surgeons, and what few there were could do but little, for the rebels had stolen their instruments, a theme we mentioned a bit ago. He declared further that he would die from sheer lack of timely attendance. We fixed the man as comfortably as we could, and when the doctor told me he could not live, I asked him for his home, and if he had a family. He said I should send for his wife. And when I came home, I wrote to her, as he told me, but I fear she may never see him alive, as he is very weak and sinking rapidly. She's bringing this work home with her, and how could you not? Both emotionally, but also literally. Going home, writing what she remembered this soldier having told her. I did not return to the hospital today, she continued, being very much fatigued and worn out, and having done what I never expected to do or thought I could. I'm becoming more used to sights of misery. So it's only been a couple of days. She's only been here for a few hours on 2 mornings. And already she says, I'm becoming used to this. And we see that as a theme as well at this and other hospitals, as well as just during the course of the war itself, is this desensitized version of these folks realizing these things about themselves, that they are quickly adapting to these situations, realizing that they're absolutely horrible, but that they have to be used to them to some degree in order to actually help these folks. July 8th, then, easily the most famous piece of Sarah Broadhead's diary. Again at the hospital early this morning, several physicians and lady nurses had come on from Washington the previous evening, and under their care, things already began to look better. And there are several, when we look at those 144 attendants who were here, for the most part, they are men, and for the most part, they are from the Army. These are from individual units. There are a couple of cases of women Army Corps nurses who are here by this point as well. But now that we're starting to see it's not just civilians, it's not just overworked surgeons, but that there are folks arriving from Washington, that there are now the sanitary and eventually Christian commissions would arrive on the scene, they would be able to provide not only more manpower, but also more materials to assist these hospitals. Broadhead continues. The work of extracting the balls and of amputating shattered limbs had begun, and an effort at regular cooking. I aided a lady to dress wounds until soup was made, and then I went to distribute it. I found that I had only seen the lighter cases. So as horrible as this has been, she comes to realize these were the lighter cases that she had been treating. These were not as grievously wounded as some others she would eventually see. And then she sees the scene from our third floor painted there on the left-hand side. I found that I had only seen the lighter cases. Worse horrors met my eyes on descending to the basement of the building. And there are two subcellars, one at either end of the building. The one here is relatively small, the one at the other end relatively large. Men wounded in 3 and 4 places, not able to help themselves the least bit, lay almost swimming in water. I hunted up the lady whom I had been helping and told her to come and see how they were situated. When we came down, she reverently exclaimed, "My God, they must be getting out of there, or they will drown." I gladly, in answer to her request, consented to assist her. She called some nurses to help, and getting some stretchers, the work was begun. They were somewhere near 100 to be removed to the 4th story of the building. 100 men, nearly drowning in the water that had come as a result of rain in the aftermath of the battle. And the damage claim for the seminary, filed August 11th. Actually, I think it's a discussion among the seminary board, August 11th. They talk about how the beams and the floorboards are not angled properly. This was a badly drained building. They have to replace several of the boards. And we can see that's largely as a result of that rain that had come, and we can see why the basements would have flooded as a result of this. Nearly 100 men, the only place that's open for them is the 4th story of the building. She continued, the way they happened to be in such a miserable place was this. On the first day during the battle, they had been taken into the building for shelter. On Thursday and Friday, the 2nd and 3rd, the rebels planted a battery just behind this hospital, 18 Confederate cannon right next to this building, on July 2nd and 3rd. This annoyed our troops not a little, who, in endeavoring to silence it, could not avoid throwing some shells into this building. Return Union fire coming from Cemetery Hill, nearly a mile away, hitting the ground around as well as directly the walls of this building. Some entered several of the rooms, meaning the balls, and injured one of the end walls, and the basement became the only safe place to which our wounded could betake themselves. And the heavy rains following the engagement flooded the floor. I did not think all could be removed today, but the lady said it must be done, and by hard work she had it accomplished. We had the satisfaction of seeing them more comfortably fixed, though they lay on the bare floor with only their gum blankets under them, but dry and very thankful for so little. I fed one poor fellow who had had both legs and one arm shot off, and though he is very weak and surely cannot live, he seems in right good spirits. Some weeks since I would have fainted had I seen as much blood as I have today, but I am proof now, only caring to relieve suffering. I now begin to feel fatigued, but I hope rest may restore me. She does not come back the next day on July 11th. She simply is too fatigued. Writing in her entry on July 9th, rain began to fall this morning, and so violently it produced a flood. This prevented me from getting to the hospital. It's raining, she's exhausted, she does not have the opportunity to get here on July 9th, and frankly, who could, after witnessing 100 men nearly wounded, nearly drowning in water, and being part of a team to drag them via stretcher up 4 flights of stairs. But on July 10th, she writes her last extensive reflection on being here at the Seminary Hospital. This morning, I again visited the seminary and was rejoiced to see the improvement that had been made in the arrangements for the patients. Just a couple of days since she was last here, and things are really improving. Nearly all have been provided with beds and clean clothing, and a more comfortable look pervades the whole building. I miss many faces that I had learned to know, and among them the man whose wife I had written to. A lady stayed with him until he died, and cut off a lock of his hair, which she gave me for his wife. At 5 o'clock, our men were brought to our home. She has men being treated at her Chambersburg Street home, and I prepared them as nice a supper as I could, and they appeared quite cheerful, notwithstanding their dirty persons, having been lying in a field hospital 3 miles from town without a change of clothing since before the battle, and with very imperfect attendance. And I think that piece of Sarah Broadhead's account is striking as well. It's something I don't think we often enough consider, is that civilian nurses, I think we put them sort of into two camps. They're treating men in their homes, or they're going somewhere, like a church, like a barn, like a seminary, the college, the courthouse. But in this case, Sarah Broadhead is telling us that she goes to those places to care for these men. But when she goes home, she's also cooking for men who are in need of care, who are staying at her house. And so, quite literally, for the next several months, when we think of Gettysburg as this vast hospital in its collective, as a vast sea of misery, as the famous line goes, that is something that you're carrying with you in what temporarily, in Sarah Broadhead and others' cases, become their day job, effectively. They're coming to hospitals like this one for long periods of time, but then they're doing that exact same thing when they go home as well, and they have soldiers who are in need of care in their residences. So we'll return to Sarah Broadhead at the end, but that's the bulk of her account, easily the person who writes the most extensively about her experience here. Now, someone whose name was not on that initial set of accounts who we're mostly focusing on this afternoon, but who is here very early on in the aftermath of the battle, is Ellen Orbison Harris. And I have a photograph of her on the next slide here. But she is here on behalf of the Ladies' Aid Society of Philadelphia, one of these benevolent ladies' associations that come over from Philadelphia, from Lancaster, the Sisters of Charity who come up from Emmitsburg, who we'll hear from in just a moment. And this is written July 4th, the very next day after the battle has concluded. And she's writing a letter, and this is something that we saw in Sarah Broadhead's account and that we see in many others. This becomes a primary responsibility for these civilian nurses. They don't have medical training, but one of the things that they can absolutely do, in addition to redressing wounds and providing things like food, they can write to soldiers' families on their behalves. And she does this for George McFarland, that eventual longest tenured patient here at the Seminary Hospital. On July 4th, she writes a letter home to George McFarland's wife, Addie McFarland, in Juniata County, Pennsylvania. Gettysburg, July 4th. Your husband is in Seminary Hospital and has kind attentions. My dear Mrs. McFarland, your dear husband has given a limit to his country, is doing well, was wounded in the leg. You have my heartfelt sympathy. May the God of all consolation comfort you. Your husband wrote his name on a slip of paper and gave it to me. So you may judge he is not very weak, is quite cheerful, am too steeped in sorrow and death, cannot rejoice over our victory. Would be glad to write more. You have my heartfelt sympathy and prayers, Mrs. John Harris, 1106 Pine Street, Philadelphia. And I looked it up on Google Maps this afternoon because I was curious. There is still a house at that location. I don't know if it's the original, but it looks like it certainly could be. It's an old brick home that still stands there today. This account appears in an extraordinarily valuable book from an extraordinarily valuable author who has given us so much of the research that went into the creation of this museum, its exhibits, the research we do today. That's Michael Drees. In 1997, he published through the Juniata County Historical Society a book called An Imperishable Fame, which is a series of firsthand accounts largely written by George McFarland. In this case, a valuable resource that is written for him by Ellen Orbison Harris during her tenure here at the seminary. Now, she does not, as best I can tell, write anything that I have seen on her tenure here at the seminary, but she does reflect a few days later on what she has experienced in Gettysburg overall, including at this hospital. On July 9th, in an account that is published just after the war in 1867, in a book called Women of the War, Their Heroism and Sacrifice by a historian and journalist named Frank Moore. Some of you might be familiar or have read accounts from the Rebellion Record, which is this incredible series of primary sources that he accumulated right after the war as well. But he includes this one brief paragraph that Harris had submitted to him that she wrote on July 9th. Am full of work and sorrow. The appearance of things here beggars all description. Our dead lie unburied, and our hospital our wounded neglected. Numbers have been drowned by the sudden rising of the waters in the creek bottoms, and thousands of them are still naked and starving. God pity us. Pity us. Now, perhaps the most famous of the aid organizations who come here to the seminary, or to Gettysburg overall for that matter, would be the Sisters of Charity, coming from Emmitsburg, Maryland, a group of Catholic nuns. And we have accounts from a couple of people who are involved with the Sisters of Charity, but none, as far as I know, from the individual 4 sisters who came here to the Seminary Hospital. And we'll see their names here momentarily. But we get a couple of firsthand accounts from one of the Catholic priests who accompanies them to Gettysburg, including here to the seminary, as well as an interesting connection, the father of one of them, who will hear his interesting story here in just one moment. But in 1897, this letter appears, which is written on July 8th, 1863, by Father James Francis Burlando, who goes through the process of discussing how on Sunday, which would be July 5th, 1863, I accompanied 8 sisters bearing provisions for the wounded. And he talks about how as they approach Gettysburg, it's still a militarized zone, to use a more modern term. They have to go through a barricade, a checkpoint, where there are United States soldiers who are checking the purposes of people coming in and out of Gettysburg at that point in time. And then Burlando goes on to say what greets him and these Catholic nuns. He says, behold us at last upon the scenes of combat, a frightful spectacle, ruins of burned houses, the dead of both armies, numbers of dead horses, thousands of guns, swords, vehicles, wheels, projectiles, coverings, hats, habiliments, covered the field and the road. We made circuits to avoid passing over dead bodies. Horses, terrified, recoiled or sprang from one to the other. The further we advanced, the more abundant were the evidences presented of a terrible combat, and tears could not be restrained in the presence of these objects of horror. They haven't even arrived in Gettysburg yet. This is just as they're coming up the Emmitsburg Road from the south, seeing the scenes of battle. Then he says, at last we halted in the village of Gettysburg, where a good portion of the Federal Army is in possession of the field of battle. Inhabitants had just issued from the cellars wherein they had sought safety during the engagement. Terror was still painted upon their countenances. All was in confusion. Each temple, each house, the Catholic church, the courthouse, the Protestant seminary, referring here to the Lutheran seminary, were filled with wounded, and still there were many thousands extended upon the field of battle, nearly without succor. I placed 2 of our sisters in each of the 3 largest improvised hospitals, including the seminary, offered some further consolations to the wounded, and then returned to St. Joseph's. So he goes back to Emmitsburg after having accompanied these nuns here to Gettysburg. So on July 9th, we're going to see a rather interesting account that is written by another man who was accompanying these women. Unfortunately, despite the significance of the Sisters of Charity, it's simply hard to find accounts directly from them about their experience here. But this is an account I won't dwell too much on because I think it's probably prime territory for a full program in its own right down the line. But it comes to us from a book called The Private War, released in 1987, edited by Virginia Walcott Beauchamp. And it's the first-hand accounts, largely long letters, written by one Margaret Smith Preston, who went by Madge Preston. She came from a slaveholding family near Baltimore in Towson, Maryland. She was the mother of May Preston, who at this point in time was attending St. Joseph's. And so May Preston, it seems to be one of the Catholic women who comes here to Gettysburg. And Madge's husband, May's father, is William Preston, who is a confidant to Jefferson Davis and an ardent Confederate sympathizer. And so I have to imagine when we see Frank Burlando, the Catholic priest who accompanies these women, and hypothetically William Preston, if he is accompanying them as well, he has come by the same route. When Burlando talks about going through these checkpoints where the United States Army soldiers are stopping these people, asking about their purpose for coming into town, I find it quite intriguing and worthy of examination further of how an ardent Confederate sympathizer and confidant to Jefferson Davis, what he feels his mission is in coming to Gettysburg. Nevertheless, in the account that we see here, he reflects, especially I'll point to the highlighted piece at the bottom, never have I seen such an unmistakable manifestation of wrath and horror. Every man's features were painfully rigid, and many looked as if their preconceived opinions of humanity had been suddenly unsettled. It's a pretty poignant account talking about, in this case specifically, he's talking about the York Pike between Gettysburg and New Oxford. He's talking about what he's seeing, how different people's faces are when they're coming toward Gettysburg versus when they're leaving after they've seen the scenes that are playing out here. But I'm interested in exploring his story just that much more. Now, these are the names of the 4 sisters who are here at the Seminary Hospital. You'll see them referred to in our attendance list upstairs as Sister Annie, Sister Gabrielle, Sister Gabrielle, I should say, Sister Mary Ellen, and Sister Melia. In the parentheses here, then, Michael Dries, in his influential 2002 book, The Hospital on Seminary Ridge at the Battle of Gettysburg, he gives us the full identities, first and last names, where available, for each of these 4 women. There is also, interestingly, we see on the attendant list for the Seminary Hospital, there's a male soldier who is affiliated with these 4 sisters, named Private Henry Gorham of the 2nd Wisconsin Infantry, an Iron Brigade veteran. He's listed as assistant in sister's tent, so he must be the conduit between military apparatus here at the Seminary Hospital and these Catholic sisters who are attending to these wounded soldiers. As you can see on his roster list here, this comes from the roster of Wisconsin soldiers in the Civil War. He is killed the following year on October 27th, 1864. It's listed as Hatcher's Run, but the date would indicate it's during the Battle of Boydton Plank Road in the fall of 1864. So an interesting side note that he is accompanying these 4 sisters who were here tending to wounded at the seminary. Another person whose name we saw at the very beginning when we looked at that lineup of 4 accounts we'll primarily focus on because they're the most plentiful, and that's Emily Souder, who comes over from Philadelphia. And she writes a series of letters, mostly in late July, writing back home what she's experiencing when she's here in Gettysburg. She doesn't spend a ton of time here at the seminary. It's mostly just this July 28th entry that we can see her time here. But she gives us some insight into what is sort of interesting to some of the folks who are tending to wounded soldiers. Because in many ways, I would argue, it's the people who are tending to these wounded who are sort of the first battlefield tourists. There are certainly tourists who are coming for that sole purpose to the battlefield to see and get a sense of what happened here. But in the off time, for a lot of these folks who are serving as civilian nurses, they too are quite interested in going around the battlefield and to some specific places, as we will see in her account. This comes to us from Tuesday, July 28th. Souder writes, "I have not been well enough for 2 or 3 days to go to the field. On Sunday, I was really sick all day and the greater part of yesterday. This morning, I thought I would ride to the Seminary Hospital and see what was wanted there, for our stores seem like the widow's cruse, always being replenished, and we all look much the worst of our experiences here. I don't know what Sarah may decide to do," talking about one of her fellow workers, "but our little company will probably depart by Thursday. Tomorrow, we shall visit the battlefield and other points of interest, and then I feel ready to go." And then she turns to one thing in particular that was quite interesting to her time when she stopped here at the Seminary Hospital. "The rebel General Trimble," referring to Isaac Trimble, a division commander wounded in Pickett's charge, "is at the Seminary Hospital. I feel some curiosity to see him, but he is under guard and not to be seen without a special permit. And I have seen as many rebels as I care to see for the rest of my days. The ward master who took me to the top of the building, whence there is a splendid panoramic view, says the general is very fierce looking. She's one of the first eyewitness accounts we have who talks about going to the cupola in the aftermath of the battle. She wants to go there as a tourist to get a sense of this panoramic view of what happened here now nearly a month earlier. I understand he," meaning Trimble, "receives a splendid dinner daily from the bounty of some sympathizer. Some ladies from Baltimore made themselves a name and a fame a few days since by furnishing citizens' clothes for some rebels to flee in. So the rumors are starting to spread. General Trimble might be just like some of these other rebel sympathizer or rebel generals. They have these sympathizers who are going to try to get them out of Gettysburg. And Trimble's is a case that goes the whole way to President Lincoln's desk. There are some messages being sent between Robert Schenck, who is commanding troops in Baltimore. He's sending messages back and forth with hospital attendants here in Gettysburg. And ultimately their question is, where do we send Isaac Trimble? Do we keep him under armed guard in Gettysburg at the Seminary Hospital? Do we eventually send him to Fort McHenry, where most of these Confederate prisoners are being taken? Their fear is that he might hatch a plan to escape there. He knows a lot of people in Baltimore. He's from Baltimore. And so we can see that even here on the ground for these nurses, that these rumors are starting to spread about this fierce, cantankerous general, Isaac Trimble. They stole several horses, she continues, and made their escape. Most of them were retaken. After leaving the seminary, I paid a visit to the Sanitary Commission tent near the railroad, and we can see that tent is photographed in this famous image. Several others that are taken out of Camp Letterman on the eastern side of town at the York Pike, including here of the Sanitary Commission tent. So that is what we have from Emily Souder. She'll pop up at the end of our time here in a moment as well again. Martha Eller from the Patriot Daughters of Lancaster. They're initially placed at the Christ Lutheran Church, and she says, we expected the hospital would soon be removed to the seminary, which is indeed the case. And she gives us a rather unique lens through which to think about this hospital. So we heard a little bit of antipathy about Confederate soldiers in Emily Souder's account. She's sort of fascinated by the spectacle of seeing Isaac Trimble, but she likewise says in that account, I've seen enough rebels that I care to ever see again. But by and large, what we oftentimes think is that it's sort of this nice notion, this benevolent notion. Blue and gray are being treated side by side. People are only concerned with red, not blue or gray. But sometimes in an account like Martha Eller's, we can see that that's not entirely how they feel. That they're willing to treat Confederate soldiers, but that there's another layer. There's an antipathy there. And we'll let her words speak for themselves. She used sidebars in the midst of her account. This is again the following summer, 1864, thinking back to the previous summer. Hearing lately of the sufferings of our poor men, sufferings too terrible for human nature to endure, on reading descriptions of their loathsome prison, and the starving process practiced upon them. She's talking about hearing accounts from Virginia, from the areas around Petersburg during the campaign in 1864. Increasingly, matters of prison camps are coming to the fore because they're now being totally overrun. Prisoner exchange program has been breaking down under Ulysses S. Grant and President Lincoln. They're not exchanging prisoners as retaliation for the execution of United States colored troops when they're being captured by Confederate armies. Black U.S. soldiers are by and large being wholesale executed. And so one of the ways that Grant and Lincoln protest that is by not exchanging prisoners anymore. There are other layers to that, but that's one of the principal ones. And she's now reflecting upon the fact that these prisons are becoming absolutely unbearable as she's reading about them. She says as she reads that, though, my thoughts reverted to the Seminary Hospital, to the white tents beneath the spreading branches of beautiful trees in which their wounded lay. So it's important to consider here, she's not just talking about this building as the Seminary Hospital. She's referring to rows of white tents, which we know was an entire complex here on the seminary campus. And when she says their wounded, she's referring to Confederate wounded. She's saying we treated their wounded. We treated Confederate wounded just like we treated our own U.S. wounded. She continues her recollection. The snow-white bed, the little table on which were placed their Bibles and the cooling drink, and above all, the watchful care and kind attentions they received. And I thought, where are the much vaunted hospitalities of the Old Dominion? Tongue-in-cheek. She's saying, where are the Southern women? Where is this Southern hospitality? Where are they as we're treating their wounded soldiers? Where the tender-hearted and inimitably courteous and kind daughters of the sunny South, of whom such boast has been made, who have figured so extensively as the self-sacrificing heroines in works of fiction? Has it all been mere fiction? Is there not one to give a cup of cold water to the famishing? Not one to say a kind word to the sick and dying? Not one to hand a crust of bread to the starving? Have all their womanly feelings and instincts been crushed out by this diabolical rebellion? Or eaten out by the essential barbarism of their domestic institutions? Which she puts in quotes, referring directly to slavery. Have their memories become so faulty, as their hearts flinty, so as to not recall the divine command, limited by no sectional prejudices, circumscribed by no north or south? And she quotes a Bible verse, if thine enemy hunger, feed him, and if he thirst, give him drink. Alas for poor humanity, she concludes, And when their brothers restored and returned to them shall tell of more than lavish kindness, may they be won to nobler thoughts and better deeds. She goes on this paragraph sidebar, reflecting on how frustrating it is to care for wounded Confederate soldiers and then hear in 1864 the conditions that are taking place in these prison camps. And she can't help but be frustrated that in all of her time here tending to wounded soldiers at Gettysburg, that no Southern women ever came to tend to their husbands and their sons. And of course, there are many layers to that. There are many reasons why that was the case. And I'm sure that there were Southern women in reverse who are frustrated that Northern women had not come to Southern battlefields to do the same. But it gives us a glimpse into the fact that even though the battle is done, the war is not when she's writing this. There's a lot of frustration. And even though she was willing to treat wounded Confederate soldiers, she still sees them as rebels. She still sees them as enslavers. And she still sees them as having torn apart the country. So we can see that there is this multiple layers to this account. It's not just a firsthand recollection of what it was like to be at this hospital, but it's all the other stuff that comes with the causes and consequences of the Civil War. She rolls it all into one. Others who were here among the Patriot Daughters at the seminary, the Patriot Daughters of Lancaster, this has been something that we can't exactly nail down. We sort of have to read some newspaper accounts to fill in the dots, fill in the blanks. But we know that there are at least 4. M.M. Kendig, a Mrs. John F. Long, whose first name we don't have, an E.C. Reichert, and an Anna C. Slaymaker. Pictured there is Rosina Hubley, who is in charge of leading the Patriot Daughters of Lancaster. Likewise, not entirely clear whether she is personally, physically here at the Seminary Hospital. Her name appears in newspaper accounts as accompanying others here to Gettysburg, but to this point, I have not seen a specific account that places her at this hospital, but certainly possible because she's with these others that she could have been here as well. And our last account that I want to focus on is from Fanny Bueller, relatively famous Gettysburg name, Bueller in general, for both she and her husband, David. Now, the context for her brief mention of the Seminary Hospital is that she had at her home been taking care of John Kalis, who is a Seminary Ridge name. He was the colonel of the 7th Wisconsin Infantry, is heavily involved in fighting here on Seminary Ridge on the first day of the battle. At one point in time, during the final attack and defense of Seminary Ridge, he goes back to his own Union cannon here on Seminary Ridge at gunpoint, and is basically starting to threaten the Union artillerists who are behind his infantrymen. And he's saying that you're causing casualties to your own men. You're shooting your own men in the back because we're trying to lay under the front of the guns out here at the Seminary Orchard. And then he is subsequently wounded in the course of the battle, and he's being treated at Bueller's home. He was shot in the left chest, and the bullet lodges into his right lung, comes across his body. So his wife, John Kalis' wife, Martha, comes to Gettysburg and is tending to her husband in Martha Eller's home. And this is the context for her account. While Mrs. Kalis remained with her husband in my house, I was able to go out every day to the hospital tents between Dr. Krauth's house. Dr. Charles Krauth's home is still here today, right along Route 30 to the north of us, built 1834, and the seminary, so in the ground where the chapel sits today, essentially. On the ground which was and is now used as a garden. General Trimble and Major General Kemper of the Confederates were among the wounded in the seminary building, and I saw them every day with many other Confederate soldiers. The tents were filled with wounded men who craved good, nourishing food. So a number of ladies had a cooking stove taken to the woods behind the seminary, so basically where the parking lot is today. And there we spent every day for weeks cooking and making nice things for men who were suffering, but who were not sick and could eat anything that was offered. These men were from both armies and were very grateful for all we did for them. So she again mentions the spectacle of seeing Confederate generals, including Isaac Trimble here. Trimble is not appreciative of the food that is being given him. Martha Eller and her Patriot Daughters of Lancaster account, at another point in the account we just heard from a moment ago, she talks about how Trimble goes on basically a hunger strike. He refuses the food that is given to him. So Not quite everyone is appreciative of Fanny Bueller and others' food, but many of them are. The vast majority of them are. But she gives us one of the few accounts of someone who was on the ground around this building. There's also a soldier who also served as a nurse named Franklin Pratt from the 76th New York Infantry, and he writes a lot about having tended to men who were in the tents outside. But that offers us another perspective that's not directly in this building, but as the hospital grew on the ground immediately around it. Other accounts, not directly from nurses per se, come to us from people like Lizzie Kritzman, who is a Gettysburg resident who on July 3rd, the story goes, sneaks a surgical kit from Dr. Robert Horner through the Confederate lines into this building, and that is reportedly the kit that ultimately is used to operate on George McFarland to amputate his leg and probably save his life. If you're interested more in that story, see if the link works here. There we go. On our website, at our education website, on the Civil War Medicine tab, if you go not quite to the bottom, but there's a section here called Corroborating Primary Sources. And the one that's there is called Lizzie Kritzman's Secret Surgical Kit. And this is a newspaper article written by famous Gettysburg named J. Howard Wirt, in which we go through several bullet points here related to the story. Is it apocryphal? Did it actually happen? What do we know about it and its key players? So she's not really a nurse, but she plays an extraordinarily important role in saving lives here at the Seminary Hospital. The other one, another famous name, the room we're in, is the Lydia Ziegler Clare Education Center. Dying the dead were all around us is a pair of accounts written several decades after the battle by Lydia, who was 13 during the battle, and her brother Hugh, who was 10 during the battle, as the two of the 5 children living here with the caretakers of the seminary, Mary and Emmanuel Ziegler. Copies of that are available through Adams County Historical Society. But that's an account that gives us a sense of a child's perspective, as well as someone who lived in this building and the experiences that they had, dressing wounds, getting water for horses and men, things along those lines. So certainly worth mentioning. And I'll end here. So at the end of her diary, Sarah Broadhead on July 14th said this: "It is now 1 month since I began this journal, and little did I think when I sat down to while away the time that I would have to record such terrible scenes as I have. Had anyone suggested any such sights as within the bound of possibility, I would have thought it madness. No small disturbance was occasioned by the removal of our wounded to the hospital. We had but short notice of the intention, and though we pleaded hard to have them remain, it was of no use. So many have been removed by death and recovery that there was room, and the surgeon, having general care over all, ordered the patients from private houses to the general hospital, to the Camp Letterman Hospital. A weight of care which we took upon us for duty's sake, and which we had learned to like and would have gladly borne, until relieved by the complete recovery of our men, has been lifted off our shoulders, and again we have our house to ourselves." That's her reflection as her time as a civilian nurse has come to an end, both here at the seminary and at her home. But in the decades that followed, many of the people who were cared for by these civilian nurses who served at the seminary hospital, this kindness, this care was something that never escaped them. Henry Kidd Douglas, in his famous memoir, I Rode with Stonewall, a Confederate veteran wounded at Culp's Hill, treated here at the seminary hospital. He remembered a little sister, his words, from St. Joseph's at Emmitsburg, who was very young but very capable, and her devotion to duty, her self-forgetfulness, her gentle manner, must have made every man she met her friend and guardian. And then, when no longer needed, she glided away, went to other duties, doubtless never looking behind. There was no crown in heaven too good for such an angel. That's how he reflects upon the care he received from one of the Sisters of Charity. Fanny Bueller, looking after John Kalis at her home. As far as she knew, in the correspondence she received right after the battle, John Kalis, along with his wife Martha, went to the Harrisburg train depot. And the bullet that is lodged in his right lung, as far as she knew, it killed him. The last correspondence she had received from Martha Kalis was that her husband was going to die of his wound. They hear nothing for several months, and suddenly David Bueller receives a letter at the Gettysburg post office from John Kalis just before Christmas, 1863, alerting him that not only is he alive, but that he's doing relatively well. They'll welcome the Kalises and their children back to Gettysburg 2 years later in July 1865 for the dedication of the Soldiers' National Monument cornerstone. And Fannie Bueller said in her 1896 account, they proudly placed alongside their own family in their own home, in the Bueller's home, pictures of John and Martha Kalis and the Kalis children, forever cemented for the care that she provided for this man at Gettysburg. Emily Bliss Souder, she returned to what she called Seminary Hill on November 20th, 1863, the day after the dedication of Soldiers' National Cemetery. She wanted to come back and see this place that she had served as a nurse. She wanted to see Lee's headquarters. She wanted to go visit the spot where John Reynolds had been killed. And her tombstone today bears the inscription, Volunteer U.S. Army Nurse, Gettysburg, 1863. And the current stone that's there today was erected by the 28th Pennsylvania Association, a living history organization, in 1995. The legacy lives on of these civilian nurses in the descendants of the people who they cared for. In the dedication speeches at Soldiers' National Cemetery in November 1863, Edward Everett talked about the women of the loyal states who have entitled themselves to our highest admiration and gratitude, including those who in hospital and tents have rendered services which millions of dollars could not buy. Lincoln reportedly cried after he heard that line, and he later encouraged others visiting the White House to read the glowing and eloquent and truthful words which Everett then spoke of the women of America. So not dealing directly with this hospital, but with all these hospitals combined. And Lincoln, reportedly one of the places he visits before he goes to the National Cemetery, is the ground around the seminary, maybe familiar to some degree with the stories that had played out here. But I'll give Sarah Broadhead the last word. She writes, my favorite line that anybody, soldier or civilian, ever wrote who was a participant in the Battle of Gettysburg and its aftermath. She says simply, on July 7th, 1863, we do not know until tried what we are capable of. Thank you all very much.